Hi everyone and welcome back to Azure for Sure Season 2. As always, I'm your host Simon and we are back once again. And I am really excited for this episode of Azure for Sure as I'm hosting someone for the very first time. I've been doing this live shows and virtual conferences over past 2.5 years, but it's surprising that I have not hosted our amazing guest for today. She's someone who's going to talk about the Azure Cosmos DB today. And for some of you who watch our shows at CSharpCorner, you know we stream the Azure Cosmos DB conference. We have some great friends at the Azure Cosmos DB team, and I couldn't. And the moment we saw the Azure Cosmos DB sessions, like, yeah, we can have more Cosmos DB sessions at CSharpCorner. So for the folks who are joining us first time, there's a comment section. You can always go ahead and drop your questions, anything that you have. And without any further ado, let's go and invite Sarah, who is a Microsoft MVP. She's a published technical author of a PowerShell book. She does podcasts, live coding guests. She speaks at conferences. She's a hackathon organizer. She's a speaker. She's a community active advocate, and yeah, she's one of the very active speaker and awarded by Such Nice. She is a rock star. So, hi Sarah, welcome to the Azure PowerShell live show.
Hello, thank you for bringing me here.
Thanks for accepting the invitation, Sarah. I'm really excited to have you today. I see you're going to talk about Azure Cosmos DB, and we're really excited for it, right?
Yep.
So, quick question. By the way, where are you joining us today from?
I am joining from Northeast Ohio in the USA.
Wow, you say what time is it?
It is, 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, it's 11:30 p.m. at my place.
Oh, late night.
Late night chat, yeah. All right, Sarah. I know this live show. It's straight for just about 25, 30 minutes to deliver the content, right? So I'm not gonna take any more of your time. I see you have shared your screen. I'm drop it to the stream now. Oh wow, that's me.
That's you.
That looks good. Oh wow. I'm not gonna take much of your time. The show is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, hello and welcome. For those of you who aren't familiar with who I am, so I am Sarah Dutkiewicz. I go by Sadukie in the community. I'm a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies, have been since 2009. I have my own consulting firm right now. I have a bachelor's degree in computer science and engineering technology, so I went to school to make sure that I could prove, hey, I know this stuff, but as you can see, 20 plus years in the field, I kind of know what I'm talking about nowadays. I organize conferences like CodeMash and StirTrek. I'm a speaker at many community events. I blog at Sadukie.com and dataadventure.com. I am married to a geek. My husband's a tech director, and I have 2 kiddos as well. But enough about me. We have about 25 minutes, and we are here to talk about Azure Cosmos DB. I love talking about Azure Cosmos DB because it's one of those that people are like, well, what is it? Well, if you notice in the title, I said data for all. And you're probably like, but for all? For everyone? Yeah, for all, I promise you. So what we're taking a look at with this is, first off, they have a bunch of different APIs, and they serve different services. So the document data, so there's 2 different APIs that we'll talk about for that. That's the Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL and Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. There's columnar data, which is Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra. There's Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Gremlin, which is graph data. There's key value data, which is the Azure Cosmos DB for table. And then the most recent one, as of October, there's now relational data at any scale available in Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. Now you'll probably see me keep going, all right, how many words did I get out? Make sure I get the whole name. But the APIs, just remember them. They're Azure Cosmos DB 4, and then whatever that they're for. Now, for those of you who are like, well, what's Azure Cosmos DB? I call it the flagship NoSQL offering in Azure. Like when I think NoSQL and I think Azure, Azure Cosmos DB is the thing that comes to mind. It's got turnkey global distribution. It's got really fast reads and writes, single digit millisecond reads and writes. It allows you to scale your storage and throughput. You have both manual and automatic failover capabilities. It's got 5 well-defined consistency models. It is analytics ready, which means that you can take your data over. There is a link between Azure Cosmos DB and Azure Synapse. There's an Azure Synapse link that you can use for that. There's security, there's encryption. Did I mention that it supports relational databases as well? And most of all, you're going to hear this a lot, which is it can be tried for free, as in no credit card required, as in all you need is a Microsoft account and a GitHub account. Now they have comprehensive SLAs, so again, less than 10 milliseconds, and then you're going to see 5 nines for your high availability, guaranteed throughput, guaranteed consistency. You might be wondering, who's using Cosmos DB? Well, who's using it? Azure Cosmos DB? You're going to see all these different companies. You're seeing some big names here too. So you're seeing things like Ford and Coca-Cola and Domino's Pizza. Can you tell it's around lunchtime here when I start going down to the pizzas and the beverages? But you can see these are big names that are using Azure Cosmos DB. And it's not just the big names, but small names too. I can tell you I was working for a smaller company when I first saw Azure Cosmos DB. But we used it in our e-commerce platform. Okay, so Azure Cosmos DB, one of the things it can support is document data. So when it comes to document data, the first API that we want to talk about is the Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL. This also used to be known as the SQL API or the Core API. This is your base for Azure Cosmos DB. So what you need to know about it, think of it as storing JSON documents. You have a hierarchy here. So you have the hierarchy for, it starts with the account level. This is the highest. So this is where you set your API. So when you create your Azure Cosmos DB account, you have to choose your API that's tied to the account. Within that account, you can have multiple databases. Within the databases, you can have multiple containers. And with the containers have multiple items. Now, with us only having 30 minutes total to talk through all this, I'm not going to be getting into a lot of the deep dives on this, but I do have a lot of slides and links to help with that. All right, so we talk about the hierarchy, how it's account, databases, containers, and items. The names containers and items may change depending on the API, but for the NoSQL API, that's what they're called. The JSON, it does automatic indexing for you regardless of your data model. Again, you've got the benefits of ingesting and serving your data in milliseconds. JSON under the covers. You will use it, SQL syntax. It is not like your SQL Server relational database SQL syntax, but it looks similar enough. Azure Cosmos DB has this feature called a change feed. I call it the hidden gem of Azure Cosmos DB because it allows you to take a look at all the changes that are coming in, and then you can do what you need with those changes. So if you want to do event sourcing, if you want to move your data from one container to another to create materialized views, things like that, you can do that with the Azure Cosmos DB change feed, which works also with the Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL API. You'll see on some of my slides I mentioned the free tier. The free tier is something that you can select on one Azure Cosmos DB account for your account. It has some limitations for each of the APIs, but just so you're aware, if you see free tier, most of the APIs, the free tier is on them. The only one that doesn't, we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay, so NoSQL, that's the core, that's the heart of Azure Cosmos DB. Who's the other document data endpoint? The API for MongoDB. So if you're familiar with MongoDB, if you're using things in the C# world, we have MongoDB.driver. You can use that to talk to Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. It has the 5 nines availability and a lot of the other things being built on top of Azure Cosmos DB. But some things to note is that it is got 3 different ways to be provisioned, or 3 different ways to work with MongoDB. Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. It's provisioned, autoscale with 0 warmup, and serverless. There's free tier available on this. There are some features that aren't supported. I'm going to put a link in chat that I know Simon will share with you all. And that will take you to what I also have the QR code for, which is where some of the features aren't supported. You can see the chart of yes supported or no supported. The Azure Cosmos DB team has done a great job of documenting everything in the system and pointing out things like, okay, this doesn't work and here's why. Okay. All right, columnar data. So this is your column stores. This API is known as Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra. So with this particular one, think of it as it's fully managed serverless Apache Cassandra. If you're used to Apache Cassandra and using node tools to manage your Apache Cassandra, you don't need that here. Azure Cosmos DB is fully managed, so that is handled for you. For those coming in from the Cosmos Mine not straight away into Cassandra, Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra uses a query language called Cassandra Query Language. It looks similar to SQL, but it has its own quirks, just like going from language to language. So think of Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra as it's got the benefits of being built on top of Azure Cosmos DB while still being able to use your Apache Cassandra tools. Now, from a C# standpoint, I want to make sure that you're aware I have a GitHub repository that I'll share a link for at the end with a bunch of C# demos for all APIs except this one. The demo that I could find for this relies on .NET Framework 4 something and .NET Core. It had no support in there for .NET 6. I checked the DataStax website. DataStax does the C# driver. And I'm not finding anything good for .NET 6. I did leave my code in there so you could see what we attempted, but it doesn't work well with that. Something to note with Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Cassandra is that it supports durable commits, whereas Apache Cassandra by itself does not. I will post that link in the chat as well. These slides will also be available after the show in the GitHub repository. Again, links there. So if you're just like, oh, I don't have these links or I can't scan the QR fast enough, rest assured, we've got you covered. All right, graph data. So graph data, I have a quick story on that, and that's talking about what we see here, which is the graph. A graph data, think about it as you're not looking at like table relationships, you're looking at the relationships within the data. So the story I like to tell is how I heard about CSharpCorner. So I'm Sadukie, and Simon here is our co-host, and we have a friend in common named Joe Godogno. And I'm sure if you've seen some of the stuff here in the community, you've probably heard of Joe. And so for me to learn more about CSharpCorner, I've been keeping an eye on what he does. Well, I know Joe, and Joe knows Simon. So I know Simon through Joe. This is a graph. These are things, these are vertexes, or V. And these arrows are relationships, also known as edges, or E. And so we can look at the relationships between things and how they go from there. Now, I've done many user group talks on the Gremlin API stuff, so if you have questions about that afterwards, feel free to hit me up and I'll answer what I can. The demos that I included in the repo for this are based off of the demos of the quick starts, but I also have a few other demos for Gremlin. With Apache Gremlin, so it is Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Gremlin is the API name. The Gremlin comes from the Apache Tinkerpop project. Tinkerpop is where the Gremlin server, the Gremlin client live, the Gremlin console. I just have a link also in chat for this one. So this operates again on the concept of vertices and edges, or like I call them, things and relationships. You use the Gremlin syntax, so you're using their G.V, G.E, and navigating with ins and outs and boths, and being able to loop and navigate until you hit a certain point. All of that is done in Gremlin syntax. Now, in the demo, we'll use gremlin.net, but notice they support other languages too, so Java, Python, Node, PHP, Go, and a console. Same goes for all these other tools that I'm showing you. If we have time for the demos, just so you can see what the code looks like, you'll be able to see I'm using the tools for that particular product. I'm not using Azure Cosmos DB's SDK to access these other different APIs, only for NoSQL's API. The rest have their own SDKs and tools. Okay. So the next API is key value data. A key value data, you may be thinking, I think we have something in Azure already. What about Azure Table Storage? Is that related to this? Well, let's look at Azure Cosmos DB for Table. So Azure Cosmos DB for Table is going to use that same table model as Azure Table Storage. So it's a managed service. It has the benefits of Azure Cosmos DB plus the familiarity of Azure Table Storage. In fact, in the demo, we use the Azure Table SDK rather than using the Azure Cosmos DB SDK. Why is that? Because the table API, when you're working with table storage, Azure Tables code is what you're going to be using in C#. But the difference between Azure Cosmos DB for table and Azure Table Storage, you're getting better SLAs. So you're getting your 5.9s. You're getting support for consumption and provision capacity. You've got your consistency levels. So in the Azure Table Storage, you have strong primary consistency and eventual secondary consistency setup. But in Azure Cosmos DB, there are 5 different consistency levels. There's more indexing support with Azure Cosmos DB for table. There's no upper limit on the throughput. There's more operations per second per table supported. So Azure Cosmos DB for table, if you're working with table at a large scale, you should consider Azure Cosmos DB for table. It uses the same CRUD operations as well. Grab the links for that for assignment as well, and that is this one. All right, and the newest of them is Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. They announced it at Ignite in October of 2022, and it is relational data at any scale. And this is something that people are like, but Cosmos, big data, lots and lots of data. Really? Relational data in any scale, even the smaller scale? Yeah, even at the smaller scale. What's nice about Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL is that it is Postgres under the covers. It is Postgres on its nodes. They are standalone servers, but they are powered by this extension called Citus. Now, if you're in the Postgres world and you're like, but Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL, didn't we already have an offering for this in Azure? You did. It used to be known as Azure Database for PostgreSQL Hyperscale, but now it is Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. And the documents do redirect. So if you're just like, let me check those docs, you'll see that they redirect here. Relational data at any scale because it's Postgres under the covers. So you have that Postgres support. You have your relational database. The difference is once you get Citus involved, now you can scale your data horizontally, and then you can make it so it's optimized for your queries by partitioning and sharding your data in a way that makes sense. Now, with Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL, so it can be started with either a single node or a multi-node setup. If you start with a multi-node setup, then you can scale it out to multiple worker nodes. They have coordinator nodes and a coordinator node and worker nodes. The worker nodes are the ones that store the shards. The coordinator node knows which of the workers have which shards. And the coordinator node knows which workers to engage based on queries. You can set it up with a single node as well if you're just starting out. If you're working with a small amount of data and you don't really need to take advantage of the horizontal scaling, don't panic. You can still use this here because like I said, each node's a standalone Postgres server. There's a lot to get into with the architecture of it and storage for that. I do have a link that I want to share with you all. It is on Microsoft Learn. So there's a learning path for Azure Cosmos DB for PostgreSQL. That'll give you a good introduction of what Azure Cosmos DB is capable of with this API, and also what you need to consider when you're dealing with scaling and horizontal scaling, the sharding. Okay, how are we on time? All right, I have a few minutes that I can actually show you the code. So I'm going to bring my code over. All right, so this is my Visual Studio code. I have a folder for demos, and each of the APIs will be within their folders. You can see with like Gremlin, for example. Let's pull up the CS project Y so you can see that the reference there, the only things I'm pulling in are gremlin.net and then Newtonsoft.json. And that's just so that I can map some fields. But other than that, I'm not dealing with the Azure Cosmos DB SDK here. I'm using the Gremlin driver to talk to the Azure Cosmos DB for Apache Gremlin API. And if I wanted to run these are all .NET Console apps. So I can go into my demos folder, and I can go into my Gremlin folder, and I can do a .NET run. And this, you'll have access to the GitHub repo at the end of here. You'll see warnings. Oh, hold on. I have to set up my environment variable. So all these demos work on environment variables. And the environment variables depend on the demo. Sometimes it's a connection string. Sometimes it's a host name, username, password. But you'll see the get environment calls in there. So what you're seeing here when I do .NET run, this is calling out to Azure Cosmos DB and executing some queries. And then this is the response that is coming out. What's awesome with this demo is that it shows things like, all right, what's the query that you're running? What's the result coming back? And then how long does it take to come back plus the charge for running it? So you can see what I'm working with here in the Gremlin API. Notice that the responses you're seeing here, we're working with JSON. So if you remember when I talked about Azure Cosmos DB for NoSQL, how it's JSON under the covers, it is JSON under the covers for all of the APIs. Sometimes I do another demo where I use, so Sovereign Web has a Cosmos DB extension that you can run in Visual Studio Code where you can query your APIs. And I've done queries where I've shown that you can query the Gremlin API and get the JSON back using SQL, but don't do that because it's one of those that they're optimized to work for these queries that are coming in. But you can see, like, okay, I want to know who all the first names, for example, of all my vertices. So you can see the results that way. The one I like to talk about with the navigation. So I have it set up so that I know Joe, Joe knows Simon. How do I know Simon? So the query is, you can see here that Joe knows a person is a query. This is the query that I want to show here, this g.v Sadukie. So starting at the circle that is labeled Sadukie, keep going, following those arrows until I hit Simon. How do we get there? And so this is what it looks like in Gremlin. So you have that g.v. Let me see if I can zoom it up a little bit more so you guys can see it. There we go. So thank you. So this g.v Sadukie, repeat out, which means keep going out until says, okay, when do we want to hit a stop? So when you need to go from point A to point B and you don't know what's in between, this is where you do a loop of repeat and where to stop at. So we can see that this, now this JSON, reading JSON can be kind of gross, but as developers, we're kind of used to these kind of things for debugging purposes. So you can see it goes from me to Joe, then from Joe to Simon. So this is what it looks like, again, with Gremlin. With Mongo, if I look at my program CS, you can see all I have is MongoDB driver. So I'm doing nothing special here. I'm just using the MongoDB driver to talk to Azure Cosmos DB for MongoDB. In my program.cs files for each of these APIs, I try to get most of the CRUD apps represented so that you can see what's going on. And so you can get started with it today. Now, these are just my demos. There's also a ton of quick starts in the Azure Cosmos DB docs that will also help you get moving today. Okay. So just so you can see, no tricks up my sleeve, things under the covers. This one does use the Microsoft Azure Cosmos DB SDK, but that's because this is NoSQL. This is its actual, the base of it all. That is its main thing. Okay. And then Postgres uses the NPG-SQL. And then finally, table uses azure.data.tables. Now, all of my demos in this repo I've done for .NET 6 because that is the long-term support. The exception, like I said, is Cassandra. Cassandra, I tried to move it to .NET 6, but its driver isn't supporting it, so be aware of that. All right, so no tricks up my sleeve, but I know we're also only so much time. So I can deep dive in most of these APIs. If you have more questions, feel free to ping me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I've got links to share on how you can find me on those. I will gladly answer as many questions as I can. And what I don't know, I'll be able to to show you where it is in the community as well, who all we can talk with. All right, so you want to try Azure Cosmos DB for free? Check this out. So Azure Cosmos DB for free, let me post the link so that Simon can post that. So Azure Cosmos DB for free. This is a screenshot. The next couple slides are just screenshots of what happens when you sign up for free. Again, to show you no tricks up my sleeve, to show you no credit card. So what I did is I went to that URL that I posted, and it takes you to try Azure Cosmos DB for free. Now, I highlighted the recommended APIs and others because you might want to try an API that is not on the recommended. Rest assured, if you check under others, you'll see that there. This requires a Microsoft account or a GitHub account. And then when we go to tell it to create, the next thing you'll see is consent. For me, I tried to do a Postgres trial, and so that's what you're seeing here. So am I going to allow them to access my Microsoft account? Yeah, that's fine, but no credit card is needed for that. Just so you're aware, if you already have a Microsoft account, an Azure account, and you want to do the trial, you can still do that trial. Just be aware that this is going to be what's known as a sandbox trial. So if you're in an Azure account and you aren't sure where your trial one for Cosmos, you'll probably have to go in the upper right corner where your account is and tell it switch directory and switch it to whatever the directory name is. In my case, I looked for my subscription. I didn't see it under my general subscriptions, and so that's how I found it, to do switch directory. But the sandbox trial, it tells you how long you have. This here, to get started, you have to change your password here. This change your password is changing your password on the database. So for me, I have a Postgres API spun up. I need to set my administrator password, which I already did. But just so you're aware, when you see this, I got to change my password. It's for the server itself. It has nothing to do with your account. Something else to note with these trials is that they are limited resources. So you can do only so much. For the Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres, for example, it spun up a single node configuration. I cannot scale that out to multiple nodes. I cannot do multiple worker nodes, no high availability. So you are limited in the trial to what you can do, but it is enough for you to get started and to work with it and to see. The demos that I have in my repo and the demos for the quick starts are fine for the trial, for this trial. So be aware of that. Let's see. Make sure there are any questions. Not yet. Okay. Now, suppose you want to learn more. Again, short period of time, not a lot to cover, but there's a lot of other resources out there. There's the Azure Cosmos DB Global User Group. They are located on Meetup. It is a virtual user group, and they have a meeting next week on Valentine's Day where I will be talking about Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres. But they also have talks on all sorts of other things, from indexing to data modeling to the various APIs to the conferences going on about Cosmos and everything else under the sun. It is a great community. It is a welcoming community. So I would highly recommend that you check them out. If you want to learn more about Azure Cosmos DB and the various APIs, but you're not sure where to get started and you're like, a quick start might not necessarily be what I need. There are also the learning paths and modules on Microsoft Learn. And this goes for anything, again, from the various API specific things to configuring storage and prepping for the Azure Cosmos DB certification. All sorts of different options to explore for learning more about Azure Cosmos DB. If you're just getting started with Azure Cosmos DB, there's a series called Azure Cosmos DB Essentials. It's on YouTube. There are 3 seasons where you get to join Mark and Mustafa and learn more about how does Azure Cosmos DB work? What are the things you need to be aware of under the covers? How can you tune things? So that is on YouTube. I'll share that link as well. There's the Azure Cosmos DB developer site, so developer.azurecosmosdb.com. So that's where we have any developer resource that you need for Azure Cosmos DB, more guidance on it. They have great links for that. There's a GitHub repo as well. So I put these slides plus all of these links plus the demos, as you saw in my Visual Studio Code, are all available on GitHub. It is a public repo, so feel free to check it out. I will be adding more documentation within the code after this presentation, but just so you're aware that the code is available right now. These slides are available right now, and you can try Azure Cosmos DB for free right now. If you have any other questions about Azure Cosmos DB, feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, the community is great. I can help you navigate it. You can find me on Twitter as Sadukie or on LinkedIn as Sadukie as well. Any questions?
That was great. Oh, that was a rocket speed, sir. I want you to catch some breath because I don't think you even stopped for even like 10 seconds, right?
No.
Yeah. And you have cursed me throughout the show for giving only 25 minutes.
I was gonna say, I'm just like, okay, I can't go deep diving through any of these because I know we're on a time limit here, but I do have a ton of links for you all to explore.
Ah,
So that's, I'm sure you're seeing them like, oh no, she's got more links and more links.
I've never dropped so many links ever, I'll be honest.
Yes, that's what
But
happens.
yeah, but I think you covered a lot in just about last 25 minutes. I can recall in the beginning you started with like there is so many APIs, right? May be you can come from any background, right?
Hmm.
Cosmos DB has gotten a lot of APIs for you, and you showed so many big companies and also small companies using Cosmos DB. And I think if you're just a developer, you're just starting up, as you shared towards in the end, the free tier that Cosmos DB has. I think it was released only a year or maybe a year and a half back. I remember earlier they didn't have it, but great. And thanks for putting my and Joe name in the examples thing. I really understood it. That is the time when I really started giving attention to your session.
That's one of those where I try to, whenever I do my demos, I try to make sure that it's relevant to the audience. So you're going to see in the GitHub repo that I mentioned Azure for sure, that I mentioned some of the
I
books
see
that are
that.
on the website, and I mentioned today's event. And I mentioned
Yeah.
Joe because Joe is my connection to your community. And so, yeah, I try to make my examples relevant so that you can relate to them as you're working with them and going, oh yeah, that's exactly how this works.
Yeah, I really loved it, and also these examples that you had in the end, the demos, are in fact, right,
Hmm.
but from across the board, maybe from MongoDB, Postgres, or whatever, right, and even also towards NoSQL. So that's pretty helpful, and having those resources on the GitHub is pretty easy, right?
Hmm.
Because I use Postgres, but not for the Azure Cosmos DB, but for the other open source backend as a service, and I love Postgres. So I just want to know. Sarah, someone who comes from a Postgres background, let's for me or for anyone, for any background, right?
Yeah.
What is going to be the very first step? Okay, now that I've decided I want to go and start learning Cosmos DB, maybe explore it, right? What is the first thing that maybe what should be the steps one should follow to get started? I understood the entire ecosystem of Cosmos DB, right? But
Hmm.
what is the step one should I take?
I would say if you're not familiar with Azure Cosmos DB at all,
Mm-hmm.
start with the
Mm-hmm.
Azure Cosmos DB Essentials videos on YouTube.
Oh yeah, you share. Yeah.
Understand the principles. Now, I guess I should qualify that. For all the APIs except Postgres, I would say
Mm-hmm.
use Azure Cosmos DB, the Essentials, to get an understanding for the foundations.
Mm-hmm.
Postgres is a different beast.
Yeah, it is.
So for that one, I would say check out the learning path on Microsoft Learn for Azure Cosmos
Mm-hmm.
DB for PostgreSQL. There's 4 modules there, and it'll tell you all the little gotchas of, okay, I have my regular Postgres database that maybe you're running a Postgres database at home
Mm-hmm.
because you're playing with it and you really enjoy it. But now you want to take a look at it and go, okay, can I scale it? Or, how does it work in
Mm.
Azure? So Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres would be able to show you that.
Yeah, and I see they have quite a good extension, also some of the content around. And you are speaking on a Valentine's Day. Come on.
I know. I get to talk about Postgres on the day of love.
Yeah. If you
So
don't have hearts in your sessions, you don't have hearts in your slides, I'm not joining your session.
I will make sure that there are hearts in there for the Postgres
Uh,
session then.
and sir, I just missed to put it in the summary, but I really liked on how you just break it down of the entire, the path of the, no, I should not say path, but the way you broke down is like you have an account in Cosmos DB, then you
Yep.
have a database, then you have
Mhm.
a container, and then you have an item. If
Yep.
someone just looks at these four steps, it's kind of it gives you an idea on how Cosmos DB works, right? You have to create an account,
Exactly.
then create a database, then a container item. Boom, bang on. Now you know how to work with it.
Exactly.
That's how cool this session was. That was absolutely great, Sarah. Any final thing you want to plug in before we wrap up the show today?
So I would say if you want to learn more about Azure Cosmos DB for Postgres,
Follow me.
come to the global meetup user group or check me on Twitter at Sadukie and tweet me and I will send links your way as well.
Yeah. All right. So, Sarah, that was really exciting. Thank you so much once again accepting the invitation. We hope to see
Mhm.
you here in India along with Joe. That would be fun.
We'll see if we can make that happen.
Yeah. All right, Sarah. Thank you so much once again. And thank you
Well,
everyone who
thanks,
has joined us
Simon.
today and watching us maybe later on. We'll see you next Thursday, same time. Until then, take good care of yourself and bye bye. Bye. Take care. Bye, Sarah.
See you.